Hello, I'm Marilyn Moore. This is part 3 of an interview with George H. Smith on the subject of happiness in a godless world. In this segment, we discuss the phrase, the pursuit of happiness, from the Declaration of Independence. We discuss Epicureanism and Stoicism, and the fundamental difference between religion and philosophy in regard to happiness. George, hello. How are you?
I'm fine, Marilyn. How are you?
I'm fine, thanks. Nice to see you.
Thank you.
George, I'd like to finish up the interview today on happiness in a godless world. I have a couple of questions that I would like to ask, referring back to some things you've said in previous interviews. I'd like some clarification and maybe some extension of your ideas.
Sure.
I know you talked about whether the debate on whether happiness can be pursued directly or if happiness is a byproduct of some other activity.
Right.
And I've been thinking about that a lot, and I've been wondering about Thomas Jefferson and his famous line about the pursuit of happiness in the Declaration of Independence. And I was wondering if you could talk about what Jefferson is referring to there.
Yeah, what Jefferson's referring to there is not exactly the same issue as you mentioned to begin with,
Okay.
whether happiness can be pursued directly. The phrase the pursuit of happiness, which certainly Jefferson did not originate, it's a common phrase in 18th and 17th century philosophy. It comes out of a particular conception, which I think I alluded to in an earlier part, namely that individuals are so variable that you cannot have one sovereign recipe, as Freud put it, for happiness. This came out of the Enlightenment primarily, although it's found in some 17th century writers. Spinoza, in his Ethics, has quite an extensive discussion about happiness varying from one individual to the next. And it's very interesting. And there are a number of philosophers of that time who start focusing on happiness in this life instead of happiness in an afterlife. And what they understood was that, again, using the Freud passage, that there's no one sovereign recipe or one way for people to be happy. And that led to the idea that, in Jefferson's case, and with sort of a libertarian type, that the function of government is to protect rights, what Jefferson calls the unalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And you leave it up to individuals to find whatever suits them in terms of their own happiness, whatever activities suit them. That's much different than an earlier, more paternalistic view, and I should say this is coming back now with a kind of the welfare state view, that government knows best what's good for people and what will make them happy. That's very foreign to the predominant Enlightenment quasi-libertarian view, which is it's up to individuals to decide for themselves. If you want to pursue activity X or activity Y, so long as you respect the equal rights of other people to do the same thing. So Jefferson's comment, as you would expect in the Declaration, is as much political as anything else. Now, having said that, let me go back to your earlier point about the direct pursuit of happiness. Mm-hmm. Jefferson once said in a letter, and I believe this is a direct quote, "I am an Epicurean." He's referring here to the ancient Greek philosopher Epicurus, who's known, and largely justifiably so, as the father of hedonism, or as one of its major exponents. Now you have to understand what Jefferson was saying, because he understood that Epicureanism wasn't this sort of, although even at that time a lot of people, used it this way, it wasn't some kind of just blind pleasure monger, or people just go out for sensory gratification. Oftentimes when people use the word hedonist today, they mean it in that kind of so-called lower pleasures of the body. Someone just constantly looking for sex or drugs, that sort of thing. That's not at all what Epicurus had in mind. One reason Epicurus got a bad name is because although he did not profess to be an atheist, he talked about the gods exist, they just don't interfere in human affairs. It's widely believed that was more of a cover. And for all practical purposes, Epicurus was an atheist. In subsequent centuries, especially among Christian writers, therefore, because he was considered to be an atheist and a materialist, and he certainly was that, it was a bad thing to be an Epicurean. And that then was associated with this sort of blind, narrow type of hedonism that we think of. Mm-hmm. But in essence, the idea of hedonism to which Jefferson was referring, we referred to a couple of things. One is that happiness itself is really nothing more than a certain constellation of pleasures. That was the main conflict that Epicurus had with the Aristotelians, one of the major ones. The Aristotelians held that you can have all the bodily or mental pleasures you want, that still doesn't really add up to happiness. Happiness is this, as I mentioned, I think in an earlier segment, this sort of thing that kind of indefinable something that sort of accompanies a successful life. Whereas for Epicurus, Epicurus had a more, I think in a sense, more realistic view that ultimately happiness is a certain constellation of pleasures that can be broken down and identified. So there's, well, I'll stop there. But as for whether happiness can be directly pursued, that's a tricky question because it's ambiguous. Certainly you can specifically pursue certain activities for the purpose of being happy. But if I just come up to somebody, what's that song, Be Happy? That
Don't worry, be happy.
Yeah. Well, how do you just be happy without doing anything? If I just say to someone, be happy, well, what do you want me to do? Well, no, just be happy. Well, I suppose there might be some sort of mental exercise you could do, but that doesn't make a lot of sense. So usually when we talk about someone being happy, we mean go do something. You know, go out with some friends, go to a party, read a book, or go to a movie. That will make you happy, or at least give you pleasure. And but if you're a hedonist in the technical sense, or an Epicurean, there are certain pleasures clearly you can pursue for no other reason than for pleasure. There's certain sexual activities, for example. People sometimes drink, not because they like the taste of liquor, but because they simply want the pleasure that comes from it. Then that brings you, which I won't go into unless you want to, but that right now, that brings us in this whole thing about whether pleasures of the body are somehow of a lower order, and people who pursue bodily pleasures, physical pleasures, cannot attain the same kind of happiness as someone who considers themselves more spiritual or more intellectual. That's a different issue, though.
Well, let's address intellectual happiness. I want to go back to a point you made about Nietzsche and Nietzsche's criticism of Christianity, in which he bemoaned followers of Christianity for buying into a reward system.
Right. Believe this because you'll get happiness in an afterlife.
So, but we also discussed certain ideas about philosophy, that if you study philosophy, the end result of that will also be happiness. Or you study philosophy was the reward, happiness was the reward.
Right.
So how are those different?
Well, I mean, Nietzsche's point is pretty, I think, evident, the point he's making, that you shouldn't believe something just because you think it's going to make you happy. A lot of people do believe that, and not just in religion. I mean, the mind is a remarkable thing. We tend to not want to investigate things that trouble us. We tend to be, if not openly self-deceitful, we tend to not want to think about things. I mean, we all experience this, not with others, but I think all of us ourselves have done this from one time to another. It's just like, I don't want to think about that now, because if I face the facts, it's going to make me unhappy. And Nietzsche's point was basically, in his opinion, that Christianity was built entirely on that premise.
Okay.
In other words, let me put it this way, and I think I made this point in my last book on atheism called Why Atheism. And this is the way I illustrated the difference between philosophy and at least Christianity, in many forms, especially revealed religion like Christianity. In philosophy, it's not so much what you believe or what conclusion you reached. The important thing is the evidence and the arguments you can use to substantiate the conclusion. In other words, in philosophy, you could have two people who reach the identical conclusion. One could have no evidence, no good reasons. The other could have an abundance of evidence and good reasons. Those in philosophy are two different situations. The fact that one person happens to have guessed at the right answer, there's no particular cognitive merit or, worth to that. Just because, I think I used the example in that book that you have two people, two kids, and the girl guesses that the number of stars in the universe is an even number. The boy guesses an odd number. Well, if you're just guessing, one of them is going to be right. It doesn't mean either has epistemological merit. You can stumble across the truth. So it's the cognitive worth in philosophy is not what you conclude so much as why you believe what you believe. Now ask yourself this. According to most Christians I run into anyway, is there a wrong way to become a Christian? I mean, you can see Jesus in the bottom of a liquor bottle, and they go, oh, that's good, you've now converted. I mean, what's a wrong way to become a Christian? You can mass murder a whole entire family, and in jail, you're redeemed and you find Christ. Well, I wouldn't condone the murder, obviously, but no matter what happens, as long as you believe, it doesn't matter why you believe. You can see something come to life in an illustration, and Jesus can talk to you in your sleep, when you're awake. You can see a vision. You can have angels talk to you. There's no Christian going to come up to you and say, you know, I'm glad you're believing Jesus now, but you know, the way you got there is not proper, and you don't have sufficient evidence really to believe, so I suggest you abandon your belief in Christianity for now until you can prove it. That's unheard of. I mean, who's ever going to say that? Mm. And it's a very, Nietzsche was making a similar point, and, and a lot of philosophers have made this point, that is there a wrong way? Can you take a wrong road to become a Christian? I don't know of anyone in Christianity that's ever said you could, because, quote, God works in mysterious ways. And that's really a significant difference that's often not emphasized enough, and that's basically what Nietzsche had in mind. Now, there's the second leg of this, and you have to remind me, you mentioned Nietzsche, about philosophers who claim the idea of happiness being a reward of philosophy.
Yes.
Well, the idea there is, and I mentioned this, I think, in the first segment, the idea of the philosopher as the sage. Mm-hmm. And especially in so-called Hellenistic Greece, after the conquest of Alexander the Great, you have the sort of the tapering off of the Aristotelian and these major schools, and you have these other schools like the Epicureans and the Stoics and people like this, and going into Roman history. And these tended to be more practically oriented. They were more giving advice. They wanted, for example, if you read Plato, all this stuff on metaphysics. These people, although they had a metaphysics, it was more the practical value of philosophy for living a good life. And if you look at the Greek philosopher, he lived in Roman times, he was a former slave, Epictetus. His advice, for example, which profoundly influenced a number of people, including Albert Ellis, this famous psychologist, maybe not as well known today as he once was, but so-called rational emotive therapy, he explicitly acknowledged Epictetus as the basis for his theory of psychology, psychotherapy. And the idea there that Epictetus had was, if you want to live a happy life, and you have to understand that by happiness, these people didn't mean so much what Aristotle meant, they meant more contented, sort of trouble-free existence. Epictetus' remedy for this, or prescription, was only concern yourself with things that are within your control. Don't worry about things that are not in your control. And therefore, you'll never be unhappy because you'll always have control over what's going on in your life. And I think I mentioned this to you briefly before the interview, when I mentioned Epictetus. He, I think, gives an example in one of his discourses about he's being dragged before a Roman emperor, and the Roman emperor wants him to disclose some secret. Where's your friend? We're looking for him. If you don't tell me where your friend is, I'll torture you. And Epictetus says, in effect, you can torture me anytime you want. I don't have the power to stop you, but I do have the internal power not to disclose the whereabouts of my friend. And the prescription there was he would not give up something he could control, namely his internal thoughts and beliefs and disclosing where his friend was, for something he could not control, namely whether the emperor tortures him or not. And he goes through this whole series of, they don't cut off your head. Who said you can't cut off my head? You obviously can do it anytime you want. I can't control that. And he goes on. Now, the thing with Epictetus, many of the Stoics tended to carry this to an extreme, even to the point if your children and wife or loved ones are killed in an auto wreck, presumably that shouldn't bother you all that much because you couldn't control that. So obviously that's taken, shall we say, a bit overboard. But the basic idea, I remember when I first read some of the Stoic stuff in college, early in college, and I thought, that's an interesting way of looking at it. Focusing on things that you can control and contrasting them with things that you cannot control. I wouldn't put it as simply as the Stoics did. I don't think it's a cure-all. But another example would be Epicurus, who I mentioned earlier, who was an earlier, he's more, I think, what was it, he was a couple hundred years at least before Epictetus. I don't remember its exact dates, 300 and something BC. You're not probably going to regret saying that because I'm not good with dates. But anyway, he's Greek period, not Roman period. And he talked about a lot of unhappiness being brought about by the fear of death. And what I call the Epicurean remedy in my last book, and was widely discussed and hugely influential among Enlightenment philosophers in particular, was he believed that basically he was anti-religion, pretty much. And what he said was, the first thing religion does, it instills you with the fear of death. Because it tells you, well, if you die, you might burn in hell or suffer some kind of punishment. This is even pre-Christianity. And he says, so then religion comes along and says, we'll rescue you from the fear of death by promising an afterlife. If only you follow our rituals or believe our dogma, whatever. Again, this is kind of similar to Nietzsche's later point.
Mm-hmm.
And his point about death was, which was repeated many, many times. I mean, even like people like, I think, Thomas Hobbes mentions it, David Hume mentions it explicitly. And he said, look, if you want to know, he said, when you die, you just die, that's it. There's no memory traces, there's no consciousness, there's no melding with the great being somewhere, you're dust. And he said, now, if you want to know what that's like for eternity, just think back about the time before you were born. And he said, do you look with fear and trepidation upon the time before you were born? No, because you're not aware of it. You think, no, there's nothing there. And he said, that's exactly what it's like after death. There's just nothing there. And there's nothing to fear because there's no more to fear about that than the eternity before you were born. And that was the classic Epicurean remedy for the fear of death. And he basically presented religion as a scam. Sort of like these priests come along, and again, this is pre-Christianity, and say, and put the fear of death in you, and then offer to cure it. And he said, just get rid of the whole system, that whole way of thinking. Now, what Epicurus didn't discuss, at least not that I recall, and this is something I think more people relate to, it's not fear of death per se, it's the fear of dying. It's that kind of slow decaying away. Mm-hmm. Voltaire discussed this as he got older, about just that kind of, he lived to quite an old age, and he kept talking about, he talked about being shriveled up on Job's dunghill or something like that, and talked about just sort of losing his faculties one at a time. Okay. And that gets into an area which I won't get into about discussions of suicide. Nietzsche once declared, in effect, that he had no choice about when he came into the world, but he did have a choice about how and when he would go out of it. And he would much prefer to have that within his control, by ending his life at the point where he thought that the pain in effect outweighed the pleasures, when life no longer becomes worth living. The problem there was he contracted, I guess, syphilis, kind of went nuts, and his sister took him over, and his sister was a case study in her own right. Mm-hmm. And so he sort of died. I don't know exactly the details of what his mental state was like, but clearly his brain was in bad shape. So he didn't catch it in time, you might say. But anyway. Mm-hmm. Sorry for the long rambling answer, but that's what you get when you talk to me.
That's true, George.
Well, thanks. No, you're supposed to go. No, that's perfectly fine. Everyone's fascinated by every random thought that occurs to you in an interview.
All right, last question.
You're supposed to reassure me.
Let's go back to some of this.
Did I tell you about my babyhood? My pre-teen years? We haven't covered what I thought about happiness when I was 3.
Stop.
Okay.
Stop. All right. You can tell me later. All right.